Thanks, Bob.
So Alan, I'll give you a couple minutes here to get your heart rate under control, and we'll get with you straight up 3 o'clock. Okay, so somewhere in the distance, Big Ben is tolling 11 o'clock Greenwich time, which is 3 o'clock our time. I don't know if Big Ben goes on daylight saving time or not, but I'll say it does. I'm looking forward to this talk as someone who grew up on the Oregon coast and for whom Dungeness crab was a central part of our sort of our way of life, as if not dinner table from time to time. I've always been interested in these critters, and it's great to learn from Alan Shanks. There's nobody who's dug in more deeply on this topic than Alan, and we're really grateful for him to that he's willing to share his knowledge and information as we try to work to understand how we can fit sea otters into the world of Dungeness crab and their both cultural and economic importance on the Oregon coast. So, Dr. Shanks, it's an honor to have you, sir. It's all yours.
Okay. So, Alan Shanks. So what I'm going to do is talk about the biology and ecology of the Dungeness crab. And what I'm going to do is first describe the history of the crab fishery, and then the natural history of the crab and why the fishery has not crashed. What causes year-to-year variation in the adult population size, which is basically the size of the commercial catch. And then I'm going to speculate on how otters and the crab fishery might interact. And I'm also going to speculate about my worries about climate change and Dungeness crabs. Okay, so history. The commercial Dungeness crab fishery started right about the time of the California gold rush. The first people that first commercial fishery was done by Italian immigrants, and the fishery was entirely in San Francisco Bay. Initially, the crabs were caught accidentally while they were fishing for other creatures. In other words, they were dragging nets and catching fish and crabs. By the 1860s, there was a commercial crab fishery. And during this period, like I said, all the crabs were caught in the bay. There was no offshore fishing. The fishery soon depleted the population of crabs in the bay, and then the fishery shifted out to the waters between San Francisco Bay mouth, and the Farallon Islands, in other words, about 30 miles offshore. The original fishing boats were sailboats with a hull design a lot like these boats here that are sitting in San Francisco Harbor. But shortly after the turn of the century, the boat shifted to first steam and then gas engines. So these boats down here have made that shift. They don't have any masts anymore. During this period, the fishermen used hoop nets baited with fish heads. And this is the same sort of trap as we use today, mostly in the recreational fishery. During the first 50 years or so, the fishery crabs were only sold fresh, live, in other words. It was illegal to can the crabs or export them out of the area. Crabs were, after they were caught, were kept in floating cages until they were sold. So you see in this picture here, those boxes with slats. Those are the boxes, the sort of cage they were kept in. That would be lowered into the water, and all of those beams sticking out into the water had cages connected to them. These laws greatly limited the fishery, especially in Northern California, where there were too few people to support a fresh crab market. Worked fine in San Francisco. This is a picture of San Francisco because there was lots of people and you could sell live crabs easily. The rules against canning and export out of the area were not relaxed until about 1940. Before this date, nearly all the crabs were fished out of San Francisco Bay. So if you look at this graph on the left, which is years on the horizontal axis and pounds landed on the vertical axis, what you see is in Northern California up until 1940, there was no crabs. Nobody was catching crabs, whereas there was a fair number of crabs caught in San Francisco. And then after 1940, you see a great increase in the number of crabs caught in Northern California. There's a couple of other things to notice in these graphs. One is that if you go down to the very bottom of the graph, you see Monterey Bay and Morro Bay, and there's hardly any crabs landed there. Basically, the population of crabs dwindles out as you get past San Francisco. So the northern range limit is down around Morro Bay, but there aren't many crabs there. The other striking thing that you can see in this graph, if you look at the Northern California landings, what you see is a real cyclic periodicity in the number of landings. It goes up and down and up and down. And it's roughly at about a 10, 11-year cycle. Trying to explain this generated a whole bunch of studies. And I don't have time to go into what is probably the cause for that, but it was probably an interaction. It was probably caused by fishing pressure. About this time, 1940s, there were other important changes in the fishery. The first was the replacement of the hoop trap with the current cage trap. So these are cage traps. The crabs are attracted to the trap by bait. In other words, the crabs got great sense of smell and they followed the sense of smell to dead, rotty things like fish heads. They enter through one or two funnels. At the mouth of the funnels are doors that spring closed as the crabs walk in. The mesh, as you can see, is pretty wide, and so that lets out small crabs, young crabs. Half the top is hinged, so when the fisherman pulls it on deck, he opens the hinge top and pulls the crabs out. If the trap is lost, and they get lost because they fish in the middle of winter when it's stormy, there are cotton webbing panels that rot, allowing the crabs that are stuck in the trap to escape. The modern traps are heavy. They got to be heavy because they're sitting on the bottom during the winter, and if they're not heavy, they just get blown away. So this led to the development of powerful trap pullers, which are hydraulically driven, and that's what you see hanging over the side of this fishing boat. The larger traps also led to the utilization of much larger boats than were fished out of San Francisco at the beginning of the fishery. So this is a crab fishing boat in Charleston. So how are the crabs fished? The fishery opens sometime between mid-November and 1 December, depending upon where you are on the coast. The opening can be delayed if the crabs are not fat enough. In other words, they haven't filled out their shell. They tend to molt in early fall, and then they fill out through the fall. And if they haven't filled out enough, then the canners don't want them, and so they don't open up the fishery. The other thing that happens is that if there's domoic acid contamination, in other words, if you eat the guts of the crab, you can get poisoned by domoic acid, in which case they close down the fishery or don't open the fishery that way either. 1 to several days before the opening, the fishermen go out and set their traps. The traps are set over sandy or muddy sand bottoms at a depth of about 30 to 240 feet. The traps are left for days, up to 10 days, before they are pulled. And when they're pulled back on deck, the legal size male crabs, and legal size is a bit larger than 6 inches, are saved, and all the females and small crabs are thrown back over the side. The survival of those returned crabs is actually quite high. So there's not that much mortality bycatch of crabs that aren't the right size. In the first, or sex, in the first 2 or 3 months of the fishing season, something like 70 to 80% of the annual catch is landed. So at the beginning of the fishery, the fishermen just work their behinds off landing crabs. And that continues for about 2 or 3 months. And then the fishery slowly peters out as the season progresses and fewer legal size crabs are available. The history of the fishery, of regulations for the fishery, runs something like this. In 1897, it became illegal to take female crabs. In 1903, a closed fall season was established. So now what happens is the fishery closes 1 August and then doesn't open again until December. Those 2 regulations probably had a lot to do with the canning industry. And because basically the female crabs are smaller than the males, so they weren't as valuable to fish. And in between August and December, the crabs molt, and then they're kind of skinny right after they've molted, so they're not really worth fishing. In 1905, a size limit was set. At that time, it was 7 inches from spine tip to spine tip, so bigger than we fish now. In 1917, a state law prohibited the export of crabs outside coastal California, and that law was changed in 1940. There was a dramatic increase in the size of the Oregon crab fishing fleet in the 1970s. This was associated with the establishment of the economic exclusion zone. At that point, the federal government said, oh, we have a rather small fishing fleet, and now we have all of this ocean territory that we're economically can exploit. So they provided loans to buy boats. And so what you see, the solid line is Oregon fishing vessels in the crab fishery, and the dotted dashed line is Washington. And what you see is right there at roughly 1970, bang, the number of boats jumps dramatically. The Dungeness crabs have been intensively fished for at least 40 years and heavily fished for more than 60. And so this is landings data for California, the blue line, and Oregon, the red line. And this is in millions of pounds of landings. And what you see, it continues along. It's not crashing, goes up and down, but it's not crashing. So why not? Most fisheries along our coast have been heavily impacted by fishing crash. To understand, we have to look at the biology of the crab and compare that to the fishing regulations. Okay, so the Dungeness crab is found from the Aleutian Islands in the north all the way down to about Morro Bay in the south. Population is broken up into 2 groups, one in the Gulf of Alaska and the other in the California current. The split is due to ocean currents. So what happens is there's a current called the west wind drift that comes across from Japan, and about at the latitude of Vancouver Island, it splits in 2. Part of it goes south, and that becomes the California current, and part of it goes north, and that becomes the Alaska current. And that split separates those 2 populations. The oceanography of the Alaska current is radically different than the California current. So the way in which populations in Alaska behave is really different than the way populations in the California current behave. come on. Okay, habitat is sandy mud or sand for adults from just outside the surf zone out to about 300 feet and within estuaries. In other words, it's a gigantic habitat. Basically, almost the entire continental shelf for almost 1,000 miles is good habitat for Dungeness crabs. They're opportunistic feeders. They prey on small fish, worms, clams, etc. They'll eat any carrion or things that stink, which is how they fish them. Predators are because the crabs are large and armored. There are not that many predators. I think larger benthic feeding sharks can eat them and rays, and obviously people eat them, and otters eat them where they're present. Juvenile habitat, they've been observed at high densities on sand, sandy mud, rock, reefs, gravel, estuaries, at depths from shallow subtidal to at least 150 feet. In other words, it looks like juveniles are everywhere. They are also opportunistic prey feeders just on small prey. They are also attracted to food by smell, and they're really cannibalistic. They're nasty little things. Everything larger than they are eats them. The first summer is very dangerous as they are tiny to small. Anything would be happy to eat them, and including each other. And to recruit, they have to make it through that first very dangerous summer. So what I mean by densely, this is a picture. This was taken off of Port Orford on the bottom. And so what has been seen in a number of locations or a number of years all over Oregon is that very extremely high densities of 1,000 to tens of thousands per meter squared. This density here is somewhere around about 11,000 per meter squared. They're sexually dimorphic. Males are up to 9 inches and females to about 6 inches. You don't find many male crabs at 9 inches anymore because they're fished as males at a little over 6 inches. Females produce from 700,000 to 2.3 million eggs a year. Animals reach sexual maturity at about 1.5 years, and they can live about 6 to 8 years. But the males enter the fishery at about 4 years old, and nearly all of them are caught at that size. Most mating occurs in spring as the females molt. The females release pheromones that attract the males. Prior to the molt, the male grabs the female, carries her around, and guards her, waiting for her to molt. And that's what you see here is a large male crab carrying around a female crab that's about to molt. After mating, the male waits for the female shell to harden and makes a sperm plug, preventing other males from mating with her. The males can mate with multiple females. Probably the reason why males are larger than females is that the males are actually competing for the females. So that is, they compete better if they're bigger. So that led evolution to make nice big male crabs. Females store the sperm until egg extrusion and fertilization, which occurs in the fall. The eggs development takes about 3 to 4 months, so slow. Eggs around here in Oregon and Washington, eggs hatch in winter, December to March. It takes 80 to 160 days for the larvae to go through 5 zoea and a megalope stage. So in the picture above, you can see there's a zoea, drawing of a zoea and a thing on the megalops. The megalope looks a whole lot like a crab, except its tail can fold out and they swim very well. These Dungeness crabs can cruise along at the megalope at about 40 centimeters a second. So they're really good swimmers. In Oregon, megalope return to shore and settle from April through September. So the fishery is intense. Nearly all the male crabs are caught each year, yet the fishery has not crashed, and it appears to be sustainable. The fishery hasn't crashed because the regulations perfectly fit the biology of the crabs. Male crabs are not fished until they're 4 years old, and they're sexually mature at 1.5 years. Hence, they have 2 to 3 chances to mate before they enter the fishery. Male crabs mate with multiple females. Hence, even though there are more females than male crabs, essentially all the female crabs each year are fertilized. And there's several studies that have demonstrated that. Female crabs are not taken, hence egg production is not impacted by the fishery. So even though the fishery is a really intense fishery, there's no impact on the reproductive output of the population. This is a unique fishery in that respect. Okay, now I'm going to shift and talk about my research, which has been aimed at trying to understand what causes year-to-year variation in the number of megalopi that come back to shore. Another way to say that is, what's the year-to-year variation in larval success? And then using those data, see how that affects the size of the adult population, which boils down to the size of the commercial landings. So to understand what I'm about to explain, the first thing I should do is talk about the general current pattern along our coastline. So in winter, what happens is winds tend to be from the south blowing to the north, and that generates something called the Davidson current, which is that arrow running up the coast close to shore. That's the Davidson current. Comes up from the Southern California bight and flows all the way up past Vancouver Island. Offshore, off the shelf, the California current continues to flow southward. In the spring, the winds shift from southerly coming from the south to winds coming from the north. The Davidson current poops out and the California current moves back onto the continental shelf. So this is a cartoon cross-section of our coastline. The blue line is the surface of the water. The black line is bottom. So this is winter. Winds are into the board. So the circle with the X means into the board. The Davidson current is over the continental shelf into the board, and off the shelf, the California current is flowing out of the board towards us. So larvae are released near the coast in the winter. So in other words, into the Davidson current. As the zoea develop, they steadily move further and further offshore until eventually they get off the continental shelf and into the waters beyond the continental shelf, and then they're moving south in the Davidson current. The net effect is that the larvae get a ride north in the Davidson, and then once they get offshore into the California current, they get a ride south in the California current. So what I've been doing for, I guess it's almost 20 years now, is collecting daily samples with this complex gadget here. It's a light trap. There's a light inside the plastic bottle, and then a series of funnels around the side. The crabs are very attracted to light, and they swim into the trap and get stuck. And so this trap is fished from April through September, and we get samples daily from the trap. And it's fished in Coos Bay, which is shown in the map off the end of FDOC. So this is the sort of data that we've got. This is data from last year in 2020. And so horizontal axis is day, vertical axis is number of megalopi caught per day. And notice that it's a log scale. So what you get is these intense pulses where overnight we catch tens of thousands of megalopi for a couple of nights, and then in between, tens of megalopi. So I've got all of these data, and I've got data from 2021 as well. So the annual catch through from April through September looks like this. And again, note that the vertical axis is a log scale. The catch this year was a little bit larger than last year. Catch of megalopi has varied from a low of several thousand during El Nino years. So the 2016 El Nino was very low, and the 1997 El Nino was very low. And the highest catches are up around 2.8 million. In other words, the annual return of the megalopi varies by a factor of 1,000. Huge. In contrast, the commercial landings in Oregon have varied from somewhere around about 3 or 4 million pounds to 35 million pounds. So the catch, the commercial landing, is varied by only a factor of 10 compared to the number of megalopi returning, which is a factor of 1,000. Oh, that's interesting. I'm missing graphs. Okay, so missing graphs, so I just have to describe what you would have seen if the graphs had shown up there. There's 4 variables that affect the return of the megalopy. The first one is whether there is a strong El Nino or not. If there's a strong El Nino, then the number of megalopy returning is quite low. The next thing is the sign of the Pacific Decadal Index. What the PDO index indicates is how much water from the west wind drift gets directed into the Alaska Gyre and how much of it gets directed into the California current. When more comes into the California current, then the California current is traveling faster. And under those situations, we get significantly higher catches. So the catches we were getting hundreds of thousands to millions tended to be during negative PDOs. Then the other thing that occurs is that affects the catch is the day of the year, the spring transition. What's happened, the spring transition is when the winter winds shift from coming from the south to the spring summer winds that come from the north. And that occurs roughly on average about mid-April. And during about a 1-week period, you get this shift from winter to summer winds. The earlier that spring transition occurs, the larger the catch. And then the amount of upwelling that occurs during the summer. So the more upwelling, the larger the catch. This graph works, okay, weird. Okay, the number of returning megalopy each year largely determines the size of the commercial catch. And seeing how all of the males that were 4 years old get caught during that fishing period, another way to look at this is that is an indication of the size of the adult population. So the horizontal axis in this graph is the log of the megalopy caught during the settlement season. So at 3 is about 1,000 megalopy, 4 is about 10,000 megalopy, 5 is 100,000, and 6 is 1 million. And the vertical axis is the log of the commercial landings. And this is amazing, I find an amazing graph, because what we've got is 2 regression lines that are significant. The black squares are years when less than 100,000 megalopy were caught. The open circles were years when more than 100,000 megalopy were caught. So what appears to be happening is that there is a change in the way in which recruitment occurs after the megalopy have settled and become little crabs, depending upon whether a lot of them are coming down or just a bunch of them are coming down. This is not understood, has not been studied. You notice there's 2 X's in the graph that don't fall on either of those regression lines. Both of those X's are indication of years when the recruitment of the juvenile crabs during the first year occurred during marine heat waves. In other words, the water was hot during that first summer, first critical summer. And I think what's happening there is that the crabs are growing rapidly enough that they're moving from tiny size where they're extremely vulnerable to larger sizes where they're not so vulnerable. But that is a hypothesis rather than a fact. So now I'm going to speculate about how otters might interact with the Dungeness crab fishery. I want to stress here that these are my speculations rather than facts. This is my best guess. Okay, otters will definitely eat Dungeness crabs. I'm sure they would love to eat them. The typical dive depth by otters is less than 40 feet. They're not real deep diving marine mammals. The crab fishery extends from about 30 feet depth out to 240 feet or so. Hence, just the shallowest edge of the fishing zone might be impacted by the otters. However, these crabs move a lot. So if otters are eating crabs in the shallow water, they're not going to, it's just the very shallowest edge that's going to get impacted. And the important point about the activity of these crabs is they're very active and sensitive animals with a great sense of smell. So it is quite possible that they're going to sense predation events and avoid areas where there's otters. There's plenty of experiments that have shown that crabs have sensitive enough capacity to smell, that they do in fact sense predation events, and depending upon the species, they either avoid the predation events, or in the case of hermit crabs, they actually go towards the predation events on snails in the hopes that they're going to find an empty shell that they can move into. So it's perfectly conceivable, but nobody's tested this, that crabs will avoid areas where otters are feeding on crabs because they can smell the predation event. Okay, so bottom line, speculating again, I don't think otters will have much impact on the coastal fishery for Dungeness crabs. The crabs extend way too deep for otter fishery. The open coast of most of Oregon is not particularly attractive, I don't think, to sea otters. And so I don't think there's going to be a big impact. Otters clearly like living in estuaries, as the work in Elakha Slough has clearly demonstrated. Estuaries are shallow with only the deepest part of the dredged shipping channels in the commercial estuaries, deeper than the otter's typical dive depth. Hence, all the crabs living in an estuary are probably going to be fair game to otters. They obviously would eat adult crabs, but again, the work in Elakha Slough demonstrated that they'll eat juvenile crabs and young of the year crabs as well. So how might this predation affect Dungeness crabs? Otters and humans are going to compete for adult crabs in estuaries. There's a small commercial fishery for crabs in estuaries and lots of recreational fishery. And these, I think, will both be impacted. Otters eat young of the year, but I don't think this will have a big impact on the recruitment to adults. And this is why the megalopi settle in estuaries, but also all along the entire coast. Hence, settlement in estuaries is on a small portion of the total settlement of megalopi. Settlement in estuaries can and often is huge, with thousands of tens of thousands of young crabs per meter squared. And the same thing is true apparently in the open coast. So it would take a large and very active and hungry population of otters to substantially impact these dense populations of juvenile crabs. The juvenile crabs are, tens of thousands per meter squared, or hundreds of thousands per meter squared. They're obviously competing for food with each other. Plus, like I said, they're cannibalistic, and so they eat each other. So otters eating juvenile crabs might actually benefit the survivors because the competition would drop and the chances of getting eaten by your neighbor would drop. So it might actually be beneficial. But again, this is hypothesizing, this is not proof. Okay, my biggest worry for the crab fishery is in fact climate change. The climate catastrophe is generating marine heat waves regularly now and stronger El Niños. These raise the seawater temperature, and Dungeness crab eggs die at higher temperatures, and the temperatures necessary to kill crab eggs is not that much higher than the typical summertime ocean or fall time ocean temperature. So a rise in temperature of just several degrees could be devastating. This hasn't been studied well at all. The only study that I've been able to find, or there's two of them. One is an older study by Cal Fish and Game, and then a graduate student's work in Seattle. And neither of those studies extended over the entire period of development of the crab eggs. Remember, that was 3 to 4 months. The more detailed study of the graduate student was only for a couple of weeks. And so I don't know what effect that's going to have. It obviously needs to be studied. Even more speculation, how might the climate catastrophe affect otters? I don't think the otters have enough trouble staying warm as it is, so slightly warmer water they might in fact enjoy. But the marine heat waves do definitely affect the prey of otters. So massive die-offs of black abalones, otter food, and starfish, otter competitors, both occurred during marine heat waves, and the epidemics were triggered likely by high seawater temperature, plus stress on the overcrowded populations of both the black abalone and the sea stars. High populations perhaps were due to the absence of otter predation. And the high population densities likely contributed to the effectiveness of the epidemics. So the return of the otters to the West Coast might make the ecosystems more resilient to climate change. And with that, I talked fast as usual. So I have finished ahead of schedule.